Hello and welcome everyone. I am so excited to have all of you here for the Dean's Honor Symposium, our first ever Dean's Honor Symposium. A couple of housekeeping issues. There are only 15 minutes between presentations, so we're gonna wrap and then you can head on to the next one, and we'll start right every hour on the hour. So we have a 3:30 and a 4:30 after this. There are lots of places where you can find directions and help find which presentations are in which room. That might be my only announcement right now. We'll flow into the Dean's List and Student Award ceremony afterwards, and you're all welcome to join. All right, thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Caveh Zehedi, and I'm the faculty person for this group. And after each person goes, we're going to have a little question and answer session, which I'll moderate. And the first person is Morgan Stevenson.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our panel. Today, we are going to be doing various presentations around the theme of violence. So I'm going to jump right into my presentation, which is just a preview of a play that I've been working on for my senior capstone piece. I am a senior at Lang studying theater and urban studies. And I will be debuting a play this Friday at the Harlem Repertory Theater entitled If We Don't Get It, Shut It Down, which is about the Baltimore Uprising. So this presentation will be focusing on state-sanctioned violence, more specifically police brutality and police abuse. Over here at Mondawmin, the police called for backup because I was recording what they do. I remember the police walked up to me and they said, "What news station is this?" And I just said, "I don't have to tell you that." Because I'm in the news business, I can blend in as a journalist. I can talk to police, but I don't like police. I can talk to them to gain information about what they do, to expose what they do, but I'm not on their side. At the time that all of this was happening, I just remember thinking, wow, the children are really making the police look foolish. You can see that it's their neighborhood, you can see that they're running around in their neighborhood, and they know what they're doing. I was told to go over there and film, and at the time I thought, this is already being filmed. But when I got there, it was different. Because CNN, they have the news, they have the story, but no matter what they're doing, they're still spinning it. They have their own interpretation of it. But when I got dropped off in the middle of it, immediately I saw kids throwing rocks at the police, and I saw the police stepping back. To me, it was kind of the high point of that situation, because these kids were really making the police look foolish. I was filming people do what they call criminal acts. Picking up rocks, throwing them at the police, burning trash cans, finding other things to throw. And then I remember a few of the kids walked up to me and they said, "What are you doing? Give me your camera. I don't want you filming this." And I just said, no, this is my job. I have to do this. This has to be recorded. Other people I saw with bigger cameras were getting beat up. But then you had people who were telling them not to beat them up, that type of thing. So I had a small handy cam and a jacket, so after a while I was just trying to hide because I didn't want to get beat up. There were moments during that time when there felt like there was no law at all. But there was law, with the army and more law enforcement coming down. I remember this large bus of police officers from other counties just pulling up at Penn North, and they come off and they're gathering their batons, full riot gear. And then that situation gets moved down to Penn North. And then people are walking into the CVS, and I'm just like, fuck. I had to record this. This had to be filmed, not from a helicopter angle, but from up close. There was a police car that was slowly exploding. And I remember people were walking up with their cell phones. To me, it was the high point of that situation. Because after that, you had people who were trying to start protests saying that we all need to be peaceful. And I didn't agree. I thought that those protests diminished everything that had happened. You had the poorest of the poor that day putting themselves on the line. There were children doing these acts. But the way that the news talks about them was as if they were fully developed adults. But because they were walking up to the police face to face, though, I thought that was inspiring. I remember this one thing from the initial protest in downtown Baltimore on the previous Saturday. I remember this white family. They were going to a baseball game, and one of them says, "I understand why they're doing this, but it's just not fair." And to me, I'm like, it's just a baseball game. You see, people were saying that they destroyed their communities, but their community was already destroyed. When you're looking at reports of killings, you need to understand that it's not just evil individual against evil individual. It stems from state violence. They're not talking about how the police are stepping back. Thank you. So the monologue that you all just witnessed in the multimedia in the background comes from a scene in my play that I just talked about briefly in the introduction. So this play that I wrote is a documentary theater play. In my second year at Lang, I had the opportunity to study documentary theater in a class called Theater of Social Action. And that type of format really stuck to me as a theater artist because I feel that it's necessary for me to use my platform to tell the stories of other people in society who often don't get to advocate for themselves. So this monologue specifically came from the person who actually filmed everything that you all just saw. So just take a minute to realize that. So by this monologue being incorporated in the play, the person who was filming kind of had an opportunity to comment on the things that he was recording. He was providing his own commentary in a way that we don't really see displayed in mainstream media. So I started working on this project in about October of last year, and it'll be premiering this week, kind of at the 1-year anniversary of the Baltimore Uprising. So I'm just gonna give a little context as to what the Baltimore Uprising for any of you who may be unfamiliar. But it was about a 2-week-long period of civil disobedience, civil unrest, protests, and demonstrations, which were all directly related to the death of Freddie Gray, who was an unarmed Black man in police custody. So this case was really similar to a lot of the cases we've seen in other Black Lives Matter cities, like Michael Brown in Ferguson or Eric Garner right here in New York City. And during the time that all of those events were happening, I was continuing my studies at the new school, so I was unable to be home and at school at the same time. And I kind of saw working on this piece as a way for me to kind of think through the things that had happened to my hometown without me being able to physically be there. So when I began working on this project, I thought that the focus of this project should be on the youth, because those are the people who we usually see in the news who are being misrepresented. More specifically, during this time period, a lot of the youth of color in Baltimore were referred to as delinquents or thugs or many things like that that just have a lot of criminalizing language associated around them. So I decided to step in as a playwright and a director to kind of portray these events in an unintervened way, because mass media has its way of intervening, kind of inserting their own narrative so that they can control what type of story is being produced. So after watching these events on CNN or Fox News, which we all know are news stations that are, for lack of better words, inherently racist, I decided to kind of figure out what was going on through people that I knew. And in having those conversations, I realized that it contrasted so much with what was being produced on TV. So for me, I thought it was important to conduct interviews. So this play is entirely comprised of interviews. The monologue that you just heard was me doing an interview with the individual, filming everything that happened on the ground. And I thought that it was my role to not really edit these interviews. So what you hear is exactly what people have said to me. So they are then advocating for themselves and kind of providing that opportunity for them. So after conducting interviews, transcribing them, I made it into a kind of cohesive piece, but it isn't really linear. It has more of an episodic feel towards it. So in the beginning of the play, people will tell you where they were when they first heard about this happening, and then it goes into providing context as to why the Baltimore Uprising happened in the first place. Because there are a lot of things that occurred in the city decades, even centuries before this event happened, and I think it's really important for people to understand that this is a systemic issue, that the things you see on TV are people responding to a type of systemic oppression that has been so formative in their entire life. So you all, if you decide to come to witness this show on Friday and Saturday, you all will be seeing these firsthand testimonies that I like to call them. So oftentimes I have difficulty calling myself the playwright because these aren't my words. My story is unimportant because I was not there during the time. But it's important for all of us to kind of understand the truth of these events so that we can all just fight towards ending this type of systematic oppression and racism that affects so many people on a day-to-day basis. So following this panel, you can ask me any questions. I'll have postcards on the side of the room. But right now, I would like to turn the attention to Storm, who will be presenting on settler colonialism.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Storm Hurwitz, and I am a fourth-year student about to graduate in global studies, minoring in journalism and design. And today I'll be speaking to you a bit about settler colonialism, which is a concept used to kind of look, in my case, at indigenous communities in what we refer to as North America. And here we are. Okay, great. So to start off my presentation, I just want to ask a question, and if you could just raise your hands if you know the answer. Who knows who inhabited this land, like what indigenous community inhabited this land prior to the Dutch arriving? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so that's 3 people in this entire audience, right? So don't be upset about it. This is obviously a demonstration of what I'm going to be speaking about in my presentation, which is settler colonialism, and you'll come to understand why I asked that question as we move forward. So first, right here, this is an acknowledgement of land and self. It's me placing myself within this presentation. I am not an indigenous person, and I think that's extremely important for me to acknowledge that. But I do feel a sense of ownership in doing this work, having taken some coursework in this literature, and recognizing my privilege and who I am. Great. So for the first part of my presentation, I'm going to go over my thesis and the concepts that are mentioned within it and worked through and explained. And then I'm going to kind of hone in on one of those concepts, which is settler colonialism, and I'm going to kind of work through it looking at the case of the Alberta Tar Sands. Great. So the title of my thesis is Subversive Tactics, the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement's Potential Role in Reattaining Indigenous Sovereignty. And the main concepts that I'm using throughout my thesis are 1, internally displaced persons, which very briefly and very succinctly, best way to kind of understand it, has a lot of legalese behind it, is generally speaking like a refugee who has not crossed an internationally recognized state border. So for example, someone who did not cross from the US into Canada, who stayed in their country but is facing similar mental, physical, environmental experiences. And then we go into nested sovereignty. So nested sovereignty is a concept. Patrick Wolf is an academic who's really dived into this. And the best way to kind of understand it, it's a little confusing maybe, is that you have indigenous communities who settler states such as US or Canada say have sovereignty. They have the ability to self-determine, they have their own jurisdiction over their land, but inherent within that dynamic is the fact that US and Canada have to say that they have this ability to do so. And within that, it's not really it's not really truly sovereignty, because these indigenous communities aren't themselves able to determine these things. Someone else has to say, hey, you have to do this. So there's different movements that are going around, like Glenn Couthard, other people who are saying, let's reject this notion, let's turn our backs to it, and turn our backs to settler colonialism and be able to regain and reattain sovereignty. So I'm kind of contributing to that literature through my work. And this kind of goes into settler colonialism, which is the concept which I will now explore a little bit more in depth. Okay, so Patrick Wolf, as I mentioned prior, he is a large theorizer in this space. And the whole idea here is that it's a form of colonialism, right? So when you think of colonialism, if you have any like background like knowledge on that, the general idea might be somewhat like, you know, someone enters into another state and they say, hey, we're going to take this community, we're going to use them to get natural resources, and then we're going to leave. And we're going to just have these natural resources. It's great for our own like state's capital and economy, et cetera. But in the case of settler colonialism, the added thing on top of that is the idea that no, we're not leaving. We're actually coming here to erase the community that exists so that we can, one, maybe use them, but also take this land. And so that's kind of when you have Patrick Wolf's quote of invasion is a structure, not an event. It's this idea that there's many different logics which are used by settler states and by these colonizers who come in to be able to erase these communities. Some of them might be outright, you can think of Trail of Tears, those types of things within history. Some of them are things like us not knowing who inhabited this land prior to the Dutch being here, right? Like the fact that that's not within our education system is a testament in and of itself of the fact that we're not aware that this ever really happened and we're not aware of whose land we're on. So, okay, so this is another quote that I'm just gonna put out there. It's kind of saying the same thing. This is coming from an indigenous academic. And then we can move into the specific case of the Alberta Tar Sands. So who knows what the Alberta Tar Sands is? You can raise your hand. Okay, great. So Alberta Tar Sands is the largest human development project in history. Manhattan is about like 22.82 square miles. The Alberta Tar Sands are about 55,000 square miles. You can see them from outer space. And yeah, it's pretty shocking. I didn't know about it before I took a class on this. And that's part of, when I mentioned the responsibility aspect in the beginning, this is part of like what fed into that. What the Alberta Tar Sands are, if you think of like Keystone XL pipeline, that's where we were bringing this crude oil from. It's this development project, which is open pit mining as well as fracking. And it's just kind of taking like this bitumen, which is tar-like substance underneath the earth, and turning it into oil because, you know, oil is great, quote unquote. Not saying that, just for the camera. But yeah, so this is happening. Keystone XL pipeline, we kind of all have this idea that that exists, but there's actually like several other pipelines which are going to happen in Canada, and thus this project continues. And one of the reason that this is like kind of like pertinent within the work I'm doing on my thesis in settler colonialism is that indigenous communities live directly south of the Alberta Tar Sands. So I don't know how many people have much background in like studying like ecology, those types of things, but generally speaking, watersheds, if you put something in water, it will carry, right? Like there's not like a boundary. They don't operate under how we have like our own boundaries and our state lines. Water doesn't see that, water doesn't do that. And so one of the main issues is that when you're having these tailings ponds, which you can see here, you can see them here, here's a larger picture. These tailings ponds are like toxic water, right? And they're just being put back into the earth. Fresh water being used to get this bitumen is then being put back into the earth. And in these tailings ponds, there's no membrane between the water, which is toxic, and the soil. So this water seeps down into the soil, moves into the Athabasca watershed, and goes directly south and affects indigenous nations. Now, this is kind of a fascinating concept, a kind of experience, right? I'm just gonna move here to this next quote, which you can read while I'm talking. And so one of the interesting things here is we sitting here, you know, like our governments might be saying this is great, right? Like we have this economic development, we're getting oil, gas prices are gonna be cheaper, et cetera, but we're not hearing the stories of these indigenous communities. And very broadly, like generalization, like in many indigenous communities, there's not really much of a separation between human and earth life, right? So like if, as you can see from this quote, if like the earth is being affected, if other animals are being affected, then humans are being affected as well. So right then and there is this like dynamic of settler colonialism occurring, right? So we here are thinking potentially, I know maybe everyone in this room is thinking a little bit differently, like this is really horrible for the environment. But generally speaking, the government is going to be saying, look, this is great, economic development, cheaper gas prices, like this is good for us. And not really telling this other narrative of how other human beings are being affected in such a way who inhabited this land prior to any of us arriving here. That's kind of like settler colonialism in general. I hope that like helped maybe like solidify what that concept means. And in my thesis more specifically, what I use this to do is to kind of look at internal displacement, which I mentioned at the beginning as one of those concepts. There's actually like international documents on guiding internally displaced persons. So I'm looking at how indigenous communities may be adopting a strategy of using the guidelines on internal displacement, which I argue are like they're like a normalized international document, meaning that you can't, it's like a rights-based document. I know that's getting a little legalese. But I argue that this could be an additional strategy adopted by indigenous communities that would be used to subvert the Canadian and US governments, because there's a specific guiding principle which states that you cannot displace persons for for economic and development gain. So that's specifically what I'm looking at, specifically what I'm engaging it with in my thesis. Great, that's me. Thanks. Thank you. And next is Giana, and she is presenting on love and poetry and a lot of great things. Here you go.
I'm actually going to steal that from you.
Go for it.
Which is kind of cool because I've never had a presentation with a clicker before, so it's like, I made it, Ma. I'm using a clicker. All right, so as Storm said, my name is Giana, and I'm a poetry major here at New School. So my capstone actually is on eating disorders and stuff like that. This is not my capstone project, but in relation to something violent like an eating disorder, around the fall of 2015, I started to think a lot about violence and how I've normalized violence in my life and how it's not the textbook definition that I always assumed it would be, and it's not the stereotype or the caricature that I think we like to uphold it to be. And so this is kind of an exploration of that, but I'm going to get out of the summary and just go right in to you guys now. So, this is how it is defined in the dictionary. Behavior involving physical force intended to hurt, damage, or kill someone or something, strength of emotion, or an unpleasant or destructive natural force. The thing that really gets me about this definition is the or for me, because destructive natural force, that seems kind of like a strange definition, don't you think? Because how can something necessarily be destructive if it's natural? Is anyone following me on that? Nature itself is not a moral force. Nature does not have a moralized center. Nature merely exists. When a tornado touches down, a tornado is not acting out of the force of evil. It's not acting out of the force of good. In a similar way, violence as it exists within all of us at its core is not existing on this plane where it's informing our good or bad decisions. It merely is an impulse. Now, whether we feed that impulse with justifications that are good or evil is up to us. And we can base it on religion, we can base it on all sorts of things, anything that we would need to feed it to according to our desires. But to just make that distinction, just so you don't think I'm condoning murder, what kind of violence are we talking about? We can talk about small violences like the softness of lightning, the slam of the car door, smashing ants to death when you're a child. How many of you killed insects as a child just to see what would happen? Come on. All right, thank you. Because there's something curious about that when we're children. And it's not necessarily that we have this impulse to do evil. Rather, it's violence as pushing our limitations. Violence can be many different things. It's a flexible force. And when we're children and we, smash a cockroach to see what happens, we are interested in what the result is, how the body crushes, the sound of it, what that looks like for some of my friends, what that tasted like. And all of those things, it is a violent impulse. You know, I think we get the idea that violence is destructive, and therefore anything that relates to it makes us scary or makes us bad. And so when we have a flash of these images like, oh, I just want to punch that fly in the face or something, that you know, not to be funny, perhaps something more actually violent is the impulse we sometimes have to hurt our loved ones, or we get so angry we could just destroy something, burn down a house. I've had the impulse to burn down my house many times. And it's not necessarily coming from this place where you're tap dancing with the devil or something. It's actually a real impulse that is carnal and primal just as much as love is. These violences are part of our human nature, and we are all violent when we want to be. It's as much of a choice as it is similarly just something that is present in all of us. So as I said before, nature is not a good or evil force. It is neutral. And additionally, violence is not an act of good or evil. It is an act. Violence does not orbit a moral center. Just keep that in mind. So just bringing in religion just for a second in talking about violence, just briefly, religion really influences our feelings towards the violent impulses within us. God, for example, in the Old Testament, just to go with Catholicism because that's what I've studied and that's all I can really speak on, is labeled as cruel for the things that he did to his people. However, in that universe, with his language, in that context, that violence makes sense. And so also in speaking about violence in literature, in poetry, especially in literature or in media that we consume, it's all a specific language. It's all a specific context. And therefore, violence becomes a means of communication with the audience. Not only that, violence is a means of communication with each other. How many times do you feel that if you hadn't gotten angry, if you hadn't screamed, that you wouldn't have been heard? Much like rioting. In rioting, if we did peaceful protests, that in a way is violent when the norm is violence. If you have something that's peaceful juxtaposed in a violent world, that is violent because it is pushing up against something and challenging it. It's confronting the world that we live in and trying to challenge it into something else. On the other side of it, if you're going through things peacefully and there is no push, there is no pull, which as human beings we get that impulse to have a push or a pull, to be violent or to scream or to yell so that people will listen, that also is a means of using violence for a good or a productive. Let's actually just never use the word good or evil in terms of this. It's a means of production. And so in the same thing, if violence is the default for all of us, then when we choose to do something else, we're actually acting against our nature. So for example, every day that you choose not to murder your boss, you're actually going against the default of your nature, which, when you think about it, we're the only mammals that moralize our murders. Animals do not question whether or not it's a good or bad thing to kill that bird for dinner. We have incredible capacity for violence just as we equal capacity for love. And we, desperate, seek to preserve our humanity. We don't want to know how easy it might be to push our love until it turns into violence, to kiss until it kills. So nature exists, it merely is. Violence is. We've already been through all of that. But now the one thing that I think might be difficult to really wrap our heads around is that violence can be a means of demonstrating love. We seek the total and mutual destruction of our egos in order to achieve the highest state of pleasure, love, which is essentially murder. Hear me out. The very first murder. And when we keep happily committing over and over again, because when we engage in love, we're engaging in, the language surrounding love, the breaking down of walls, the shattering of preconceptions. It's violent language we use to talk about the things that happen to us, the state of breakdown in the body of emotion and ego and all of these things that happen to us. And not only that, the obsessiveness, the jealousy, the lust, the carelessness, all of these things are violent emotions because they truly do push us over and out into a state of being which we are not familiar of being with. So in November, I started watching this TV show called Hannibal on NBC, which, if any of you follow it, it's about Hannibal Lecter. It's a really good TV show. I definitely recommend it. And the reason that I started thinking about violence in the first place was because the two main characters happen to be in a love relationship, and in the love relationship use violence to communicate with each other. However, their violence is not the small, socially acceptable violences we've been talking about today, but they actually do commit like actual violence with each other, like gutting each other and things like that. So this, for example, got me thinking about a lot. Ouch. So the reason why I showed that clip specifically is because the context of that is that one of the main characters betrayed the other. So the reason that the story then progressed that way was because the gutting of his beloved was actually meant to demonstrate heartbreak, and in that way to demonstrate love, hurt feelings, their connection. And in Will, the character who was gutted, in allowing himself to do that, accepts the love that is being transferred to him. I'm in no way saying this is normal, but in literature, this is what is happening, is that love is a mutual acceptance to kill and be killed. And in the smaller way in our daily lives, we do feel in a certain sense that our loved one has the opportunity to hurt us. And not only that, we give them permission to hurt us. And that's the way that love, for me, connects to something violent. Now, where poetry comes in, since I am a poetry major, and I just wanted to close this, which thank you guys for at least attempting to wrap your heads around where my headspace has been in for at least a couple months now. I really appreciate it. Poetry might be a little bit easier to access it through. With poetry, line breaks can cause disruption in the flow of thought. Poetry, in my opinion, should really only confront, violate, disrupt, or kill, or else what is it worth? What does it do? What does it save? Or what will it save? For me, I really do believe that poetry allows us to have access to these kinds of impulses without feeling ashamed of them, or without feeling that we're bad people, or that if we are bad people, we should apologize for feeling that's what we are. Because we all have this same impulse. We all have these carnal feelings that no matter how much we try to control them for the sake of our humanity or the preservation of our goodness, it does not necessarily mean that we are not good because we feel these things. And in poetry, we really actually get an opportunity to get at the heart of these. And a lot of times this is manifested in structure. As you can see, something violent like how poetry should only, and then going straight into the capitalization of confront, violate, disrupt, kill, that's kind of aggrandizing and aggressive, the way that looks on the page. And in a similar way, poetry can appear to be that way and use structure, form, or technique like that. So I'm going to leave that up, but I wanted to read a poem for you guys to close, and hopefully in listening to the poem, you'll hear what I mean about some violence in poetry, and it will also incorporate some of the themes I've been talking about today. But I hope you will just listen and indulge me as I speak from behind the podium. And if I could, I would ask you to sort of close your eyes and just clear your head of everything you've already been listening to, and just listen while I read this for you. Gun-toting kids. Red Solo Cup kids. Deer left for dead in the road. Fridays, kissing. Frank Ocean low on the FM radio. Every weekend, our lashes caked with methamphetamine. We made promises to be softer. Look what they did to us. Look how they wrung our hands from branches and called it holy. The spectacle of our adolescence contained in Kool-Aid and Frank Ocean low on the radio. We stopped singing along at least a month ago. Sunday cleanse, cold coffee with milk at the mall, and the rest of the evening wasted at the bottom of the pool, alone now and sent towards suicide. Oily and dry skin. Next, popping pimples and Molly pills in the bathroom. These days, so much less than we bargained for. There are no dragons in this story. If there's a God, he puts out and he bleeds all over the couch. We've learned to be resourceful. We've had to make our own fun. After all, these nights are too honey-soft to just laugh it off like some gunshot. Our unhappiness. It's the delirious kind that takes pleasure in the first cut, but apologizes when it sees what it's done. We kings of glue smell and black hands. We whine and try to buy cigarettes. We try to find a way out of our isolation. We call our mothers in some stranger's basement. Bubblegum wrapper, sugar packets, mothers we can't depend on. Come inside now, condomless, loveless. I don't want to be mean to you. I don't want to kiss your friends. Love is half kill the bitch and half I love the way you do this. Bad kid, bad trip, diluted milk, hand-holding in the drugstore. I smile at your naked blue body, so pleasant. Please honor mine less frequently. Make me something sterile or otherwise pink. You were nice to me at the beginning. Your hands around my neck are the pinnacle of romance. Don't go where I can't follow. Don't go into heaven. We maggot kids, always someone else's burden. Who leaves the door open for them? Who leaves the door unlocked so we can get in? Belonging to you, stars shoot love, fast and rose-rubbed. While we fuck, your chain hangs heavy, down heavy, like your heart. I can see the times you loved and they never loved you back, the crucifix dripping into my mouth. I don't ask where you'll go out into the antifreeze of Chicago December. I apply coconut cream lotion and braid my hair tighter. This is all I have. A bed, remnants of loves that were more backhand than gentle kiss. We scrape sex off our linens and save it for later, with our heroin and white noise and screams on the TV. We black syrup brats, we kids of the sick kingdom. That's all. Thanks, guys.
So we have just a few minutes for questions and answers. I'm just gonna come sit in front.
Okay.
Yo.
And you can ask questions on anybody's panel. It's a free-for-all.
Yes.
I really enjoyed all three of your presentations. They were courageous and interesting in so many different ways. But one thing I thought I saw in all of them was a focus on rights, right? The right to protest, the right to be violent, the right to reclaim. And I was wondering, like in the rights context, there's always this sort of balance between rights and protections. And so I was wondering if each of you could speak about protections.
Let's just start with Morgan.
Okay, yeah, I think just your question in terms of rights, I think that the flip side of violence is rights. More specifically in my piece, the type of violence that you all may have seen, even in the multimedia, was a direct result of violence that was already pre-existing. So in that people are asserting the fact that they should have rights, I feel like the way that protectiveness comes in is being able to advocate for yourself or being able to even show people that this is an issue when a lot of people are unaware of that.
I think I understand what you're saying. If I'm not, feel free to clarify me as I'm speaking. As far as protectiveness goes, that's equally something that I find there's a true lack of, and I think there's a lack of space to be protective of the things that you care about, and protective in a way that's special to you. So if you're likely to be more aggressive or more violent in protecting what you think is worth protecting, either people are going to call you a hero, or they're going to call you, as we've seen, especially recently, an instigator, or just somebody that's rioting and is too angry. There's a lot of people out there protecting what they care about, and a lot of those people being called, just selfishly hellraisers, just as if they don't have something that's keeping them going for the sake of a bigger picture. And I think when it comes to protecting what you care about, any means that you have to do that, you're gonna do. And it's kind of, I think, something that you realize also, like when you become a parent, the lengths you would go to for your children, similarly the lengths you would go to for your friends and family. Nothing really can stand in your way. And so, violence is definitely a part of that when it needs to be.
Yeah, so I think in the case of the work I was doing, I think protection becomes a very potentially problematic word because in and of itself, a settler state cannot provide protection because the entire goal of the settler state to indigenous communities is to erase them, right? So to say, hey, let's look to the settler states to then provide protections to indigenous communities, you're in effect saying, let's continue this erasure. And so for that reason, that's generally how I think about protection in the case of my work. Yeah, that would be my answer.
Yes. Hey, Jen, it's 3:15. Do we have time for one more question? Okay.
Two more. How can we use your play to end the nation state?
I mean, well, that's my big audacious goal with doing this piece. Like, yeah, this is gonna end police brutality. But no, I feel like this play is the tool to take those steps. So how many of you were even familiar with the things that I was talking about before I actually talked about it in the monologue? Was any of it shocking? Was any of it jarring? No? Yes. So you knew every single thing that I said that, okay. Well, let me provide a little context that I actually forgot to provide. In the monologue that I was actually doing for you all, this happened on a day when public transit was shut down for about a few hours. So all the kids you see in that clip have no way to get home. So imagine commuting to the new school and living uptown or something, and you can't take any trains to get home. What else are you gonna do in that amount of time? You're gonna figure out how you're gonna get home, right? So that's where that clash kind of comes from. So I feel like by me kind of candidly providing this information to people who may not have known that before, that kind of intrigues you and makes you say like, wow, this is fucked up, we need to do something about it. That's my hope for this piece. So even after the play is over and whatever next steps I decide to take, I think it's important that people are exposed to this to have their own conversations, because conversations are kind of how we start doing all of this advocacy work that we need to do. So you can't like fully advocate for someone if you're not fully understanding them. So I'm hoping to just provide more context for people so that you can then provide that context in your own communities.
Yeah, also I want to jump off with what you just said as well. Like I think, like the first question you asked, how many people are familiar with this? I think like you asked this in one of our rehearsals and you put it more in the context of like who's seen this type of footage, right? Like who's been in their home and has seen this on media? And I think like that's also like one of the amazing things about your work is like you're highlighting, right, stuff that's coming from the ground versus stuff that's being curated by mass media, which we know is curated by like the top 1% to be like Bernie Sanders. But yeah, so yeah, I think that's also huge.
Okay, we're out of time, Jen? Okay, we're out of time. We have set up for the next presentation. Thank you all for coming.